Right, you'll probably be sort of pleased to hear this is going to be the last video I'm going to do linked to exchange rates. We've got to think about a devaluation of our currency. Now remember, a devaluation is where the government deliberately, or the central bank deliberately, look to bring down the value of the currency. Okay, so this could be under a fixed exchange rate system where you think the currency is overvalued. If it's overvalued, then it can mean that you've got a trade deficit. Overvalued currency will mean that imports become cheaper and exports become really, really expensive. So what we're going to draw is a diagram that we call the J curve. So imagine here you've got a trade surplus. Here you've got a trade deficit. Here you've got an overall zero on the current account. Here you've got time since depreciation. Okay, now what the assumption is, if you think about it logically, is that what should happen over time is that if you start off with a deficit and you devalue your currency, then your trade deficit should start to disappear relatively quickly. So what should happen is, as your currency loses value, then there'll be a growth in export demand, and imports become more expensive, so import demand will fall, and that will start to see the trade deficit fall and start to disappear. Now in reality, it's not as simple as that. Nothing ever seems to be in economics. Imagine we start off with a trade deficit. Now what the J curve shows, actually, in the short run, your deficit might actually get bigger before it starts to improve. Okay, now let's think about why. In the short run, what we know is that imports, so think about the short run, let's call this A. Imports will increase in price. Exports across the world will become cheaper for people to buy. So what we'd assume is that what would happen is that exports would increase in demand across the world, and imports would fall in demand. Okay, but the trouble is, in the short run, it's highly likely that the demand for these will be price inelastic. In other words, demand is unresponsive to that kind of change in price. So what you might find here then is that because our imports are now a lot more expensive than what they were before, demand might fall a little bit, but the overall money we spend on these imports will actually increase. We haven't got the ability to shift towards domestic production, or maybe firms have already negotiated contracts long term with certain firms to bring in these goods and services. So it means that the money we spend on our imports might actually increase and therefore worsen the trade deficit. Over time, in the longer run, what we should start to see is this is exactly happening. In the longer term, things should become less price inelastic, maybe even become more price elastic. And that will basically mean that exports will increase and imports will fall. But the trouble is, it will take time. It's not something that can happen overnight. So in the longer run, domestic firms might be able to develop advantages, invest and produce things that used to be imported. And then we'll slowly see that trade deficit start to fall. Okay, now linked to this, think about a devaluation. It will create a quantity effect. Okay, a weaker currency will mean that exports will increase and imports will fall, but it also creates a price effect. And what the price effect says is that the weaker currency will mean that imports become more expensive and exports become cheaper. So a devaluation will only improve trade if the benefits of the quantity effect outweigh the price effect. Okay, yeah, okay, think about the quantity effect. Exports might increase, imports might fall, but if the benefits are outweighed by the higher price of imports, then ultimately the devaluation will not improve the trade in the short run. So in the short run, I'll go back to the previous diagram. What you could say at A is the price effect is greater than the quantity effect, whereas at B, quantity effect is greater than the price effect. And linked to this, you've got something called the Marshall Lerner Condition. Let's call it MLC. Now at A, the Marshall Lerner Condition is not met. Here, at B, it is met. And what the Marshall Lerner Condition says is that a devaluation will only improve the trade if the price elasticity of demand for imports and export added together is greater than 1. Only then will you see the quantity effect outweighing the price effect on the economy. So overall, if you were given a question, will a devaluation improve trade? Well, you could argue that yes, assuming the Marshall Lerner Condition has been met. But in the short run, it can actually make the trade get worse before it starts to improve.